Greetings, vinyl community, and welcome to another VC Friday. Today I'll be talking about the 1975 through 76 project of Yes solo albums. This will be a quintuple dose of prog, so Steve Carlson, pay attention, this is good for you. Before I get down to the main order of business, the person who won the drawing last week for the Dr. John LP has not contacted me yet. So Danny at Discoveries, if you're out there, please drop me a line with your mailing address. Email is in the video description. In November 1974, Yes released their seventh studio album, Relayer. This was their first album, and as it turned out, their only studio album to feature their new keyboardist, Patrick Moraz, who had replaced a departing Rick Wakeman. The remainder of the year, 1974, was devoted to touring for the album. They also toured for about a month in the spring and did more touring in the summer, but mostly they decided that the year 1975 would be devoted to coming up with a solo album from each of the five members of the band. Now, Atlantic Records, apparently sensing that there would be a gap in Yes's productivity as a group, rushed out a compilation album, Yesterdays, which came out only 3 months after Relayer was released. This is an album featuring material by the first lineup of the band, taken mostly from their first two albums, along with a single B-side, plus the 10-minute version of Simon & Garfunkel's America, recorded by the later version of the band with Rick Wakeman and Steve Howe, in between the Fragile and Close to the Edge albums. So, it was considered kind of a pretense or an act of hubris to think that each member of the band had it in him to create a worthwhile solo album, but in fact it turned out to be perfectly reasonable because we got 5 very good albums in 1975 through 76 from the Yes members. First out of the gate with his solo album was guitarist Steve Howe, who released Beginnings in October 1975. And he definitely was keeping the Yes brand alive by using Roger Dean for the cover artwork. And it's a nice gatefold production, all the better to show off Roger Dean's work that was so firmly associated with Yes. And although it's very hard to see, there's also a Yes logo, the Roger Dean logo in there in black on almost black. Steve Howe is known as a guitar collector. He has quite an extensive collection of different guitars and used a lot of them in the studio and on stage, so he gets to show off a few of his favorites in this photo inset, but he's shown actually playing his signature instrument, the Gibson ES-175, the guitar that's firmly associated with jazz, and Steve Howe was kind of going against the grain by using a big hollow-bodied electric guitar rather than the more typical Stratocaster or Les Paul type solid body guitars that most rockers used. Interestingly, we've got this photo inset taken by Roger Dean's brother, Martin Dean. There is an ad for the album that ran in the press showing a black and white rendition of some of the cover art where we actually get Roger Dean's drawing of Steve Howe in the same position. Although Beginnings may look like a Yes album, it doesn't quite sound that much like Yes, given that Steve Howe was such a major compositional force between Yes's epics, like Close to the Edge or the massive Tales from Topographic Oceans project. He doesn't present any Yes-like prog epics on this album, he decided to do most of the playing himself. So it's a very guitar-oriented album. He plays mostly guitars and guitar-like instruments such as mandolin and bass and pedal steel guitar. He does play a little bit of keyboards, a little bit of Moog synthesizer. Mostly his accompaniment is the then current Yes drummer Alan White, or the original Yes drummer Bill Bruford. So a lot of the tracks are just Steve Howe with one of the drummers. He does have a couple of tracks with some interesting sidemen. There's a lovely instrumental, The Nature of the Sea, which features 3 members of the band Griffin, who had supported Yes on some of their tours for the Relayer album. Those members are Graham Taylor on guitar, Malcolm Bennett on bass, and David Oberle on drums. And that track is those 3 plus Steve Howe playing guitars, steel guitar, mandolin, and harpsichord. Beautiful piece, and one of 2 instrumentals on the album. The other instrumental is, well, the closest thing to a Yes-like epic. It's 7 minutes and 30 seconds long, but it's not a rock piece. It's an orchestral piece done with a small chamber ensemble of strings and woodwinds, along with Steve Howe, guitars and steel, Patrick Moraz guesting on harpsichord, piano, and Moog, and Alan White on drums. So we've got 3/5 of Yes on the track plus the chamber orchestra. Beautiful piece. There was no single released from this album, but there was a promo video for the track Beginnings, which is very cool to watch because it's a completely different performance to what's on the album. It's just Steve Howe on classical guitar and Patrick Moraz on harpsichord, without the orchestra, without the drums. Very cool. Another track that got a promo video made was Ram, which is a sort of bluegrass piece, a sort of bluegrass rag thing that recalls the clap from the Yes album. And the video for that shows Steve Howe breaking into or splitting into, I think, about 4 or 5 different Steve Howes playing the different instruments on the piece. Which features dobro guitar, banjo, steel, and washboard. Now, another aspect of this album that differentiates it from the parent group is that Yes always had the beautiful, clear, choir boy vocals of John Anderson. And Steve Howe does all the lead vocals on this album himself, and he was kind of ill-advised to do that because he is not a lead singer. He always sang with Yes, but as the third man in the harmony. John Anderson would take the lead. Chris Squire, whose voice was very, very similar to John Anderson's, would sing harmony, and then Steve Howe would be at the bottom of the harmony. And that was fine, but as a lead singer, his voice is very plaintive and limited and often quite strained on here. I actually really like the plaintive quality of it. I feel it fits the songs. It's got its own character, but a lot of people have trouble with the singing on here, and it's hard to argue with that. Like all of the Yes solo albums in this series, Steve Howe's Beginnings got a special custom label design. It is the only one, however, that did not get a special custom inner sleeve. Surprisingly, perhaps, it wasn't that big a hit in the USA. It charted at only number 63. It did a bit better in the UK, where the Yes albums, or Yes solo albums, got a bit more attention, and it reached number 22. of the solo albums to reach the market was Fish Out of Water by the bassist Chris Squire. This came out at the end of 1975, and again features a gatefold design with Chris reflected in what looks like a car's fender, strumming an acoustic guitar there, and some nice stained glass art on the back. British copies apparently came with a poster based on this design. We didn't get that on our copies here, but the fish appears also on the label, fish being a nickname for Chris Squire. And the inner sleeve features a variant of the cover design along with the grading without Steve. So now you see him, now you don't. Steve, Chris. This is Chris Squire. I already did Steve. Sorry, you've had your turn. Beautiful album, and many people's favorite of the 5 albums from this series. An interesting characteristic of it is that there is no lead guitar. So that in itself creates a fairly unique sound world. Chris Squire didn't want anything to interfere with his bass being the sort of backbone of the album. Not exactly the lead instrument, but definitely more prominent than a bass usually is in a rock band. He's accompanied again by Bill Bruford and Patrick Moraz, who, as they had appeared on Steve Howe's albums, they also appear here. Bill Bruford plays drums throughout. Patrick Moraz plays some organ and bass synthesizer, probably only on one track. It's not specified who exactly plays where. We also have Mel Collins, fairly fresh out of King Crimson. No, he'd been out of King Crimson for a while. He may have been in Camel by this point, playing saxophone. Jimmy Hastings on flute, brother of Pye Hastings from Caravan. Barry Rose on pipe organ. And the use of the pipe organ is an idea that they would carry on to the next Yes album in 1977, but that's another story. And playing the piano is Andrew Price Jackman, who was a bandmate of Chris Squire's from a pre-Yes band called The Syn, S-Y-N. There is also orchestration on here. So it's a very lush, very cinematic, very melodic album. It does open with a great rocking punch, very proggy but very rocking in the song Hold Out Your Hand. Another highlight of the album is the song that was released as the single, Lucky 7, which is a slow, brooding number with jazzy electric piano and a 7/8 time signature. And here is a copy of the promotional version of that single, which is one of these stereo on the blue side, mono on the red and white side releases from Atlantic. The stock copy, which I don't have to show you, had the song Silently Falling on the B side. And there are only 5 tracks, so the bulk of side 2, after the slinky, jazzy Lucky 7, is given over to Safe, Cannon's song, a real epic, which after going through the main song part, builds into a huge repeating theme. It's a bit like Ravel's Bolero, where you hear the same musical idea over and over again, but it keeps building and it keeps being treated to different orchestration. And it finally just explodes and leaves us with this coda of the bass feeding back and just playing this sort of mournful little soft landing for the whole album. So Fish Out of Water, wonderful, wonderful entry in the series. It again did not chart all that highly, making only number 69, nice, on the charts. And in the UK, it made number 25. So did slightly less well in both markets than Steve Howe's album. The next couple of releases came out right on top of each other in the spring of 1975, and our third release to look at is Ramshackled by drummer Alan White. Now this is a solo album by Alan White in name only, because he doesn't sing on it and he didn't write any of the material. He just plays the drums and produced. He was not treated to a gatefold production like the other covers, but he did get a nice textured cover stock, if you can see that, and we get the Yes logo embossed, which is very classy. He did get both a custom inner sleeve with this interesting artwork. Some people, I think, may think that should have been the front cover, and the band members, and a lyric sheet hand-lettered by presumably Alan White under the alias of Dr. Toe Jam, courtesy of Chilblanian Embassy, Lumbago Hertz. The band members on the album are basically members of Alan White's pre-Yes band, a band that started out with a couple of members of the Alan Price Project in the 60s and split off to form their own psychedelic band, Happy Magazine, which evolved into a band called Griffin. That's Griffin. Not to be confused with the prog rock band who toured with Yes. That was Griffin. And Griffin evolved into Simpsons Pure Oxygen. So this is more of a Simpsons Pure Oxygen album than an Alan White album, except that, well, Alan had to make a solo album because everyone else was, so he got his old pals, and those included Peter Kirtley on guitar and vocals, Colin Gibson on bass and percussion, Kenny Craddock on keyboards and vocals, Alan Marshall on vocals, Bud Beadle on saxophone and flute, along with Andy Phillips on steel drum, Steve Gregory on added tenor sax and flute, and Henry Lowther on trumpet. I forgot to mention when talking about Steve Howe's beginnings that a couple of the members of this lineup do appear on that album. There's one track with some heavy saxophone, and that's provided by Bud Beadle, along with another sax player, and the bassist on the Ramshackled, Colin Gibson, also plays on that track, along with Steve Howe, Patrick Moraz, and Alan White. So once again, there's that 3/5 of Yes thing, because you've got that on that track, you've got that on the title track from Beginnings, you've got that on Chris Squire's album, because you've got Chris Squire, Patrick Moraz, and Bill Bruford playing together. And on this album, there's another example of the 3/5 of Yes concept, because we get a track titled Song of Innocence, or Spring Song of Innocence, on which Alan White is joined by John Anderson on lead vocals and Steve Howe on guitar. So that's a very Yes-like track in the middle of an otherwise not very Yes-like album at all. This album is stylistically all over the place. He does really good heavy fusion jazz instrumentals. He does funk. He does reggae. And the opening track, which is the song that was released as a single, is Ooh Baby Goin' to Pieces, which is a really interesting sort of conglomeration of smooth soul vocals with a very tropical feel and these prog rock and fusion elements that just sort of fade in and out. And I've always likened it to listening to two different radio stations where different formats are kind of interfering with each other. This is another one of those stereo mono promos from Atlantic. The track One Way Rag was the B-side on the stock copy, and again, those are rare as hen's teeth, and I don't have a copy of that to show you. The album's label has the old man made out of naughty ladies, same design as on the inner sleeve. And there was a column in one of the local rock papers, Blind Date with Flo and Eddie, where they would play records for Flo and Eddie and they would give their candid and usually comical reactions. And always remember that when they played this album for Flo and Eddie, they said, "It's got a custom label. It must be somebody from Yes." It is somebody from Yes? Okay, be sure to put down that we guessed who it was before we even heard the record. The album was not a hit. It did not chart at all in the USA. It made number 41. Is that right? 41 in the UK, according to my notes. You thought I was doing this all from memory, didn't you? So did I. I don't think they did a whole lot to promote the album, apart from the fact that they did do a single release, and they did have that video that I don't know if it was shown in America at any time point, but you'll notice that my copy is a cutout, even though I purchased this in the summer of 1976. So you have to wonder if they kind of dumped this one on the market without a lot of thought towards it being a hit.
Sound of flute, now it's mute. Birds delight day and night. Nightingale in the day, lark in the sky. Leaves of Maryland to welcome in the year.
The next solo album to appear was I by keyboardist Patrick Moraz, also known as The Story of I on some reissues. The title is actually this symbol of this golf tee looking thing with a globe or a world or a disco ball on the top of it. And this is associated with an elaborate science fiction story that Patrick Moraz relates here and then explains in the hand-drawn liner notes how it all relates to the music and what the music is and who's doing what. And he obviously spent a whole lot of time and going into very nerdy detail on everything involved with the world of I. Again, a custom label design featuring the golf tee thingy. And this album does not feature 3/5 of Yes. This album does not feature any of the other Yes members. It does feature some jazz fusion luminaries. Alphonse Mouzon is on the drums on side one. Ray Gomez is on the lead guitar. Jeff Berlin, who would soon join Bill Bruford's solo band, is on bass. The lead vocals are by John McBurney and Vivian McAuliffe, and Patrick Moraz plays many, many keyboards. This is his list of all the keyboards he plays on the album. Grand piano, Hammond C3 organ, Mini Moog, Micro Moog, and Poly Moog synthesizers, Taurus bass pedals, Mellotrons Marks 1 and 2, Orchestron B, Supersonic Vocaltron, whatever that is, ARP 2600, Pro Soloist, Axe synthesizers and string ensemble, Fender Rhodes 88, Clavinet D6, AKS Synthi A synthesizers, String Thing synthesizers, harpsichord, marimba phone, Pace drum synthesizers, DPM digital sequencer, electronic slinky, paced gongs and orchestral cymbals, assorted percussions, plural, and alpine horn. Yes, alpine horn, one of those huge long things that they play up in the Alps and go hoot on. This is very proggy, but not at all like Yes. It features a very tropical Brazilian sound with tons of percussion, including a huge ensemble of drummers from Rio de Janeiro. So the whole album is meant to be one long piece of music, but he divides it up into tracks here. There was no single released from the album per se, but Atlantic did put out a Strange EP on a white label with one vocal and one instrumental track on each side. I don't know exactly in what context that was released, because it's not, one of the standard stereo mono singles that they were usually servicing to radio stations. So maybe they were servicing this to different radio stations. Maybe they figured this would go to jazz radio stations. So I don't know where that white label came from or what it was about, and I do not have a copy to show. There was an actual commercial single release of the track Cachaça in Spain. So the whole Latin nature of the album did strike a chord in that country. In this country, the album wasn't a huge success. It made number 132 in the charts. In the UK, it was number 34. And the last to appear, last but certainly not least, because it's my personal favorite of the five, was Olaus of Sun Hillow by John Anderson, which came out at the end of June 1976, by which time the band was already out on tour, doing a show that would include a sprinkling of songs from the various solo albums, but those tended to get dropped pretty quickly from the set. Beautiful cover art, elaborate gatefold package with a sort of storybook explaining the concept of the album. And this is a concept album. It has that in common with the Patrick Moraz album. They're both science fiction, fantasy concept LPs built around a story. And another thing it has in common is that there are no other Yes musicians playing on this one. In fact, there are no other musicians playing on this at all. It's a John Anderson album, a solo album in its purest sense. Now, John Anderson was not known for playing instruments with Yes. He was not a virtuoso on any instrument, so he had to teach himself a lot from the ground up in order to create his vision on this album. It's inspired by the artwork from the Fragile album by Roger Dean, which showed a world breaking up and a vessel, a kind of flying vessel, leaving that world. So the story of Olaus of Sun Hillow is about a world that is going to destroy itself, and a group of sort of wizards or sages gathering up the various tribes of the planet to whisk them away to safety in a flying machine called the Moorglade Mover. The four tribes are representative of what John Anderson did in the studio. He recorded this at a mobile home studio on a 24-track system, and he assembled the instruments in four groups in the corners of the studio. So in one corner, he had various kinds of ethnic drums from around the world, and that represented one of the tribes. And in the other corner, he had his keyboards. So he had the Mellotron and he had the Moog synthesizer, which he had to figure out because he knew nothing about the technical details of getting sounds on the Moog synthesizer. So it was all very experimental for him. In another corner, he had his string instruments like guitar and sitar and a koto and Celtic harp, which figures very prominently. And in the fourth corner, he had bells, a big collection of bells. So this was just a months-long overdub frenzy to create the song, the concept album. It's still very beautiful, very melodic. He does a lot of strum-along kind of songs that are very simple and folky at their base, but elaborated with layers of overdubs of different colors, different instruments. The artwork by Dave Rowe, because Roger Dean wasn't available to do the work, as shown, tells the story of all the sort of fancifully named characters and tribes. And then we get a little artwork of John Anderson himself, along with his family and Pooch. Some interesting thanks on here. Besides some technical thank yous, he mentions all the members of Yes by first name, along with Brian Gulland. Brian Gulland was one of the members of Gryphon, the Gryphon Gryphon, who toured with Yes, who did not play on the Steve Howe album. So I'm curious what the connection is there. And the last name on the thank you list is Vangelis. Now, of course, John and Vangelis would go on to produce a number of duo albums. But this led to a lot of people believing that Vangelis played the synthesizer on this album. That John Anderson couldn't have come up with all of it himself. It must have been Vangelis. It sounds like his style, all the sort of bubbly and drifting sounds on the synthesizer. So even RCA Records, Vangelis's label, apparently was fooled and called up Vangelis and said, "What are you doing playing on a record on Atlantic when you're under contract to us?" And he had to say, "I didn't play on that album. I don't know why John Anderson's thanking me." But that just shows how well John Anderson internalized the music that he heard from Vangelis, who had been tapped to join Yes before they settled on Patrick Moraz. Although there's a famous story about the audition where Vangelis was just obviously not going to fit in because he just loved playing with all the equipment. He wanted to sit down at the drums and not just actually try to work with the band members and create a song. So that was where the Vangelis connection originated. Again, we have a nice custom design. Inner sleeve and John Anderson with some of the technical folks he worked with. So Olaus was the most successful of the solo albums. In the US, it reached number 47, so being the most successful still wasn't enormous, considering that Yes themselves regularly went top 10. All of the 70s albums from Fragile on, at least the studio albums, made the top 10. The live triple album, Yes Songs, narrowly missed the top 10. It charted at number 12, but that's to be expected for a live album that was a triple and probably quite a bit more expensive than most people in 1973 were used to paying for a record. In the UK, Elias did actually reach the top 10, made number 9. And that was in the summer of 1976. There was a single released from the album, and for once I do have a stock copy, Flight of the Moorglade and To the Runner. These are two of the more basic strummy folky songs that I alluded to. The album does have its more spacey and experimental moments, but these are the more accessible side. And there is also that mono stereo promo of just Flight of the Moorglade on both sides. To promote the Yes Solos albums, Atlantic released a special sampler LP titled Yes Solos, which contained 10 tracks. Each side contained one track from each of the 5 solo albums. I don't have a copy of that to show. The album was simply a white cover with a Yes Solos label pasted on, and white label LP with the titles of the tracks. So was it pretentious of Yes to assume that every member could create a solo album? It wasn't the beginning of solo albums from Yes, because in 1973, Peter Banks, the band's original guitarist, who had been replaced a couple of years earlier by Steve Howe, released his solo album, Two Sides of Peter Banks, very fine record. And also in 1973, the band's then current keyboardist, Rick Wakeman, released The Six Wives of Henry VIII. Great album, again featuring guest appearances by various Yes members. Bill Bruford is on here, Steve Howe is on here, Alan White is on here, and Chris Squire even is on here. Chris Squire doesn't play on a lot of albums outside of Yes, so this was the beginning of a very, very long and prolific solo career from Rick Wakeman. His second album, this one was a success, but his second album, which was after leaving Yes, Journey to the Center of the Earth, that one was a huge hit. So that one gave him a real impetus to carry on. So at the time, Yes was doing all these solo albums. Rick Wakeman was not idle, and he released his album No Earthly Connection. And the results were kind of much the same as the then current Yes members. He reached number 67 on the U.S. charts, right there in the same ballpark with Beginnings and Fish Out of Water, and number 9 on the UK. I just said Elias was number 9 in the UK. It was number 8. You got to keep me honest. So that was what was happening. It was a bit of a come down for Wakeman from hitting the top 10 with Journey to the Center of the Earth, but he certainly didn't let that stop him. In fact, nothing has stopped Rick Wakeman. Heart attacks and all sorts of things have not gotten in his way, and he's still out there plugging away today. He's doing farewell tours, but no, nothing stops Rick Wakeman. That's enough and more than enough. Thanks for watching. Be well. I will talk with you again soon. Bye-bye for now.